but we can still wait for a couple minutes.
It's really fun to see some familiar faces in the chat window. So hello, everyone.
All right, well, I think we can get started. Welcome everybody to Colloquium. We're about the halfway point of the semester. I hope everybody is doing well, or as well as possible under the circumstances. We're pleased today to welcome Julie Fosdick from University of Connecticut. Kip Hodges is going to introduce her in just a minute. There are no announcements from CC leadership, but I do want to just make sure everybody's aware that next week we have one of our special colloquia. 3 of our graduate students will give short presentations in the colloquium, Emily Zawacki, Sierra Ferguson, and Ren Raming. So please take time to come to that, and let's please congratulate them when you see them for stepping forward to do this. It's a little stressful and daunting for them, but very cool for both them and for all of us. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Kip to introduce Julie.
Thanks, Ariel, and welcome everybody, and a special welcome to my good friend Julie Fosdick, who's here, as Ariel said, from the University of Connecticut. Julie began her educational experience getting ready for her professional career at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and then she went to Stanford for a master's and PhD degree. She did a postdoc at the University of Arizona, spent some time at Indiana, and now she's at the University of Connecticut, as I said before. Julie's one of this new breed of people who work on sedimentary basins and interrogate them in ways that help us understand a wide variety of Earth processes, and in particular tectonic processes. So this talk is going to focus on that in particular, and I'm very interested to hear what she says. So Julie, please take it away.
Great, I will share my screen in just a second here. All right, well, wonderful. Thank you so much for the invitation to give a presentation at your colloquia, and also just for the opportunity to present my research. So let me give this one moment. I think PowerPoint is held up here. All right, can I just get a quick confirmation from someone that you are viewing my screen in full view?
Yes.
Okay,
yep.
Great, awesome, thank you. Thanks all. I would love to have been visiting in person this week, but given the situation and circumstances, I'm still honored to get the opportunity to present virtually. So what I wanted to present today is really a project that developed a few years ago in collaboration with a colleague, Kim Blizniak at San Jose State University, which really brought me out of kind of the deep time geologic record of sedimentary basins that Kip described, and brought me forward in time towards more younger processes and younger tectonic landscapes. So I'd really like to acknowledge Kim in her collaboration, as well as some students that worked with me on parts of this project. Louis Wersan, a former master's student of mine at Indiana University, as well as Jackie Giblin, our former UConn master's student, and also a current ASU student as well. I'd like to acknowledge a number of folks that have helped out. Kai Johnson at Indiana University kind of made the matchmaking in this project. Jonathan Matties provided a lot of really helpful insight and constructive thoughts on this work. And a lot of the work has been done at the Arizona LaserCon Center, and with permission and approval from the Mission Creek and Whitewater Preserves, where we collected much of our work. And funding from SCEC, the Southern California Earthquake Center, and the National Science Foundation has been instrumental in getting much of this work off the ground. So I'm going to bring your colloquium back kind of to Earth and talk about some of the work that can be done in looking at how we understand our Earth landscapes, with some important implications for how we work in other settings as well. So as Kit mentioned, I work in sedimentary systems. Much of what I focus on would be reconstructing long-term drainage patterns of different sediment routing systems across the Earth over deep geologic time. The work that I'm going to show today is using this information to constrain more recent fault slip motion on a part of an active plate boundary in the San Andreas Fault in Southern California. and very broadly trying to understand how topography forms, especially along active tectonic plate boundaries, and the processes that lead to the kinds of landscapes that we see here. And we do this by looking in very great detail at the sedimentary record, the evidence of erosion and mountain building through time. So when we think of large-scale transform plate boundaries, shown here, this is an example of beautiful imagery of the San Andreas faults in the Carrizo Plain. They're really important components of the global plate tectonic landscape. So here shown on the map on the right, you can see the San Andreas fault separates the Pacific plate moving up to the northwest relative to the North American plate moving down to the southeast, recognizing that these are important boundaries that shape the topography, landscapes, and sediment routing across the Earth, and that these are important because they can generate large magnitude earthquakes and pose significant seismic hazard to populated areas. So scientifically, they're important to study for understanding the Earth and beyond, and they're important for societal reasons in terms of the hazards that they can present. Now, thinking beyond the Earth, we can also recognize that understanding the topography and imagery of plate boundaries, for instance, this is an image of Mars, suggesting some structures that can be controversial, but understanding how we interpret these kinds of landscapes from imagery alone that can give us a sense of potential types of faulting. So this is a fault zone that's been interpreted as a transform plate boundary or a large-scale strike-slip faulting system that we can use as an analog when we're looking at Earth or other planetary bodies. The San Andreas fault isn't the only important strike-slip transform plate boundary on Earth. Of course, the Anatolian fault, just shown here, is another excellent example of recognizing the imagery that you can get from looking at something like a digital elevation model to see that landscape. Now, these are the modern data sets that we can image and view and look at, but when we go back in deep time, we have to rely on the sedimentary record or other geologic records to reconstruct those path events. And this is important if we want to look at things like an earthquake rupture forecast map. This is a map of California showing the highlighted in red here, the main strand of the San Andreas fault that cuts down, and you can see the complexity of the different fault structures depicted as these little fence or border boundaries with different colors highlighting the percent likelihood of a rupture forecast. And so from a societal standpoint, having a clear understanding of how these faults work and interact over short time scales and long time scales ends up being very important for our well-being. So I want to talk a little bit about what we'll call markers of long-term lateral fault motion. And in this case, we'll refer to something called slip rate. So this is an important input for when we are going to assess seismic hazard and risk assessments, which is something very beyond what I do in my own work. But slip is the displacement or that lateral movement along a fault. And so here's a beautiful image of the Hayward fault that cuts through the image shown here. This is cutting part of the cement and sidewalk, and you can see the displacement or the slip in this beautiful image example from when the sidewalk was first formed, and then another more recent slip marker shown here from somebody's Sharpie pen from 1997. So this lateral fault motion is measurable. It's the surface record of horizontal plate boundary motion. And on the short term, we can look at things like man-made or human-made sidewalks. We can study offset streams. We can look at landforms. But in the deep time record, we have to rely on some of these older kinds of resources, like reconstructed zones of where sedimentary rocks were deposited, intrusive rock bodies, or other distinctive geologic features that might be useful. And much of this is giving us basis for what we'll call a paleogeographic reconstruction of what Earth's surface might have looked like. One last example I just want to show of the ability to see these kinds of images. This comes from some imaging of the strike slip system off of offshore Gulf of California. And what you can see here is looking at the topography or the landforms underwater. And I just want to draw your attention to some of these features shown here where you can see these submarine canyons cutting down and depositing these little lobes of sediment on the seafloor. And in this interpretation from the faulting, you can see that the deposits have been offset or displaced from their canyon heads themselves. And so in this case, this is remote imagery collected in the submarine setting, but we can start to see the kinds of landforms that are associated with these actively tectonically deforming features. Now, in the deep record, I want to bring up this concept of displaced sedimentary rocks. This, for a long time, was considered this concept of a coal train analogy, but I think we could come up with a more renewable energy analog for now. But the concept here is that there's a fault separating the depositional zone, which would be the coal trains, and the source area. And that as that train is moving away from faulting of that plate boundary, the source area is progressively depositing into these different coal units as it's moving away. Looking on the right-hand side here, it gives us another depiction of that geometry, again, now including some of the landform or different landform features, where you can have these beheaded streams that are cut or offset from their original source that might be located somewhere else. You can have different topography forming, might we call shutter ridges or places of uplifted topography, again, deflecting streams. And that this broad sedimentary alluvial system depositing sediment off of that mountain front. So the source area is up here. We're going to be focusing on the deposits that come from these results of fluvial or alluvial sedimentation that's coming from these rivers and different sedimentation units, that they would reflect distinct sources in their upland regions across the fault. So that's kind of the basis or the background for understanding how we use sedimentary character to try to reconstruct how much motion or movement has occurred across this fault. And here, again, these arrows are just depicting the direction of motion that this upper block is moving to the relative right compared to the lower block moving to the relative left. And that here is depicted as a right lateral strike slip fault. So established methods used for a long time in different settings and recognizing their role for evaluating this long-term fault motion. So again, you know, the sediments themselves can capture that geometry of sediment routing very nicely. This is an image that I stole from some of my work in the Central Andes and Patagonia, where I work mostly, to give you this visual of what the character of sedimentary deposits would look like, largely based on their different color schemes of these very large fluvial systems and their large alluvial fan deposits. These are the deposits derived from all of these upland mountains in this different region. So different geologic setting, but I want to use it to illustrate the value of trying to picture the landscape that we see from collecting samples along these alluvial surfaces and resulting sedimentary deposits. All right, so let's dig in. San Andreas Fault System, I've already introduced it. It's this very important part of the plate boundary between the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate. I'm going to be focusing on a region down here where it's structurally very complicated because the San Andreas Fault boundary takes this big bend and creates some of the most beautiful mountain landscape in Southern California. So it's important it links the Cascadia subduction zone up in the north, where we have subduction zone and Cascade volcanoes, with the transtensional pull-apart system in the Baja California Rift Zone located to the south. All right, zooming in on the Southern California sector, I'll be focusing on this area here. And I wanted to include this map largely because it shows the distribution of different large earthquakes that have occurred across this area and the location of those epicenters to give you a sense of the importance of this part of the plate boundary for that seismic hazard. And one thing I'll point out is that this red line of rupture basically ends right here. And the region I'm talking about has all of these black lines. These are the faults that have not had any recent rupture in their most recent history. So we recognize that whether or not they could be active or inactive compared to their rupture history here. And how we classify faults as active and inactive, it ends up being kind of important for some of the implications of this work. All right, I just want to stop real quick before I zoom in on this box and ask or offer a chance for anybody to ask a question. I think everybody's okay so far. Okay, well, please don't hesitate to stop and interrupt along the way, although there will be time for questions at the end. So zooming in on our study area, this is all of these black lines represent the faults. They're part of the San Andreas Fault System. The system is made up of a number of different independent fault strands that each have individual motion and history among them. We're going to be focusing on this area here on a part of the San Andreas Fault called the Mission Creek Fault. And it is located in the Whitewater and Mission Creek Preserve. And it's also now located in part of the Sand to Snow National Monument, which is one of the newest national monuments added to our national park system, which is pretty terrific. This map is a little different, but it gives us a distinction of how how faults in this area have been mapped. So the red lines indicate active faults. These are ones that are considered as contributing to seismic hazard and seismic risk in the area. So those are all of these red lines here. And in general, this is these two active strands are the ones that are considered the primary part of the San Andreas fault system that cut up through this structurally really important and topographically interesting area called the San Gorgonio Pass region, or San Gorgonio structural knot. And you can see that all the black lines and red lines make it very structurally complicated. Our study is on this black line up here, which is basically the continuation of the active part of the Mission Creek fault strand. And from here westward, it's mapped as inactive. And that's really important to our study and again, the implications that we are considering. And so a big question that geologists are working on in this area is asking, how is strain transferred? And strain is deformation. It's transferred through this pass up to the northwest along the San Andreas Fault. And to answer that, we have to look at some of the faulting behavior and slip rates, right? That's the deformation rate of the fault system over different time scales. And so we're going to be going back in time and looking at sedimentary systems in this area here. Now, the San Andreas fault zone is made up of a number of different fault strands. And this is an image that is showing the activity of these different strands over different periods of time. This is from Kendrick et al. Paper in 2013. And it shows, again, the active ones here. So this is in millions of years and present day. We have the Garnet Hill strand that's active, the Banning strand, and the San Bernardino strand. And then some of these older strands, as we move back in time, were active and took up a ton of deformation, but then ceased their activity at a certain time. And so our fault of focus is this one. It's the Mission Creek strand. It was active for a substantial period of time and took up over 90 or almost 90 kilometers of displacement. And most records have suggested that its activity ended about 1 million years ago. And so our question is really looking at some motivation for understanding if there's a younger record of that faulting history that would extend that black line further in time. So thank you, Google Earth. This is an oblique view looking at the Mission Creek fault that cuts through our study area. This is again where it's been mapped as inactive. It's a right lateral fault. So this block is moving to the relative right, and this block is moving up to the left, to the northwest. And what you can see here are some of the different features of the area. I want to highlight the active drainages that I'll be referring to in this work. So this is the Whitewater River. It's a very large braided channel deposit that you can see cut through here. The Mission Creek cuts down through here, and Morongo Valley Canyon. I'll refer to a few other rivers and drainages, but these are the main ones of interest. And the deposits that we looked at are called the Cabezon Fanglomerate. These are Pleistocene in age, and they're about 400,000 years to 260,000 years old. And some of the younger deposits on top are as young as 100,000 years. And so one key thing is that previous work, yes, question, yes, I will talk about precise plate boundaries a bit in the end. Thank you for that question. Previous work had suggested that these fanglomerates, or these sedimentary deposits, were derived from what was the ancestral Whitewater River that would have flowed like this, where the yellow lines are, rather than where it flows today in its current drainage. And so the idea is that the proposed flow of the ancestral Whitewater would have suggested that the deposition occurred after the Mission Creek faulting. So this white fault was active until 1 million years ago, and then these deposits were put in place, provided by the ancestral Whitewater drainage river. A little sneak preview, what we're going to be showing is a suggestion that they were actually derived from Mission Creek and were displaced to the west since their timing of deposition. So let's focus on this area, and I want to talk a little bit about some motivating reason for why Kim Blizniak looked into this area and kind of roped me into looking at the sediments for a couple of different reasons. And so one is, if we look, there's a beautiful exposure of the exhumed or uplifted part of the fault zone. That this is the older segment of faulting. You can see it's several meters wide. Of the rock representing the shear zone of where those two blocks moved past one another when this part of the fault strand was the active strand of the San Andreas fault. And this has been uplifted and exposed so we can see it and study it today. One of Kim's efforts has been to analyze recently available LiDAR data. So this is a high resolution remote imaging of this part of the fault, where you can see a high resolution that we haven't been able to see previously. And what she was looking at was an interpretation of some of the different landforms within this area. And she noted that a number of these drainages are offset and routed around by different shutter ridge topography and different kinds of landforms that she's interpreted to suggest that there is some deformation or uplift of these different landforms, and that the drainage patterns have been shifted. So think back to the submarine data set I showed from the Gulf of California. And so this was an indication that there might be more recent movement of this part of the fault system along the Mission Creek Strand. And so she was approaching it from a geomorphic perspective, right? Looking at the landforms that were visible through this high resolution LiDAR data set. So that was some motivation for why she wanted to look at the deposits of the Fanglomerates. And so that's how I got roped into this, is my work in sedimentary provenance analysis and sedimentary basins. So that's what brought us to this area. I want to highlight one other important geologic map. This was published by Catherine Kendrick and others, looking at the geology of these different units. And so the different colors are just displaying different ages of rocks. And you can see in orange here, these represent those Cabezon or Mission Creek Fanglomerate units that I'm going to be talking about. You don't have to worry about the details of the map, but I do want to highlight that our study area encompassed this big hill up here, which was made up of most of these Quaternary deposits that we were looking at studying. So what was great is that we had a really excellent geologic base map for what some of these units had been previously mapped as. And so we could reference that framework for understanding these different depositional units. All right, so our methods here, this is a type of work that we call sedimentary provenance analysis, where we're looking at the composition and character of sedimentary units to try to figure out their provenance or their source, where they came from. And one method that I'll show today is one that's called class counting. And this is about as exciting as it sounds, where you are looking in the outcrop or in the deep subsurface and mapping diagnostic compositions of the cobbles and pebbles that those rock types would directly reflect the source of those units themselves. And so these are some really beautiful photo examples of what kinds of clasts or cobbles we saw in these deposits. And we went through systematically characterizing and counting the composition of these different clasts to come up with a modal distribution of, how many different granodiorite clasts that we might have, or how many different biotite schists we might have within that area, or gneisses. And so this is truly just looking at the character of the sediments to try to figure out what source units they came from. Now that has its limitations, so we coupled this with a technology that capitalizes on geochronology and radioactive decay. Many of you are probably quite familiar with this, and many more of you are probably not. It capitalizes on the mineral zircon, where it's collected from sedimentary or detrital rocks, and it uses different decay schemes of uranium and thorium isotopes in their decay chain series to stable lead daughter products. And so that's the basis for the clock that we're going to be referring to. And this is useful to us because uranium lead ages in the mineral zircon record the timing of crystallization within magmatic units or high temperature metamorphic units that can tell us it's not just a granodiorite, it is a 100 million year old granodiorite. And that starts to hone in our sources in a much more specific way. So if we collect zircon grains extracted from sediments and we date them, and we can come up with a distribution of those age populations that are going to give rise to those crystalline sources that might be diagnostic to their source areas. And so that's a really important method and basis for a lot of sedimentary analysis, is this tool of detrital zircon geochronology. Now, this is most effective if we know the ages of our potential source areas. And so in new settings, sometimes it's difficult to collect this kind of data, but one great thing about working in this part of Southern California is that there was quite a good, representation and literature on the ages of these different crystalline rocks, so the igneous and the metamorphic rock sources. So that was a great part of this work. So when we collected our sandstone or modern sand samples collected from river drainages, we would extract the zircons themselves, mount them in epoxy and polish them, and collect single crystal analyses of individual grains to figure out the timing of when these crystals formed. So we did this through laser ablation. This was laser ablation ICP-MS analysis, and this was conducted down at the University of Arizona's Zircon lab. This image on the right here just shows a sample that's not polished yet, but you can see the distribution of mostly zircon crystals that are derived from a variety of different sediment sources within that area. All right, so just a last slide here on geochronology. The idea here is if you have an age probability distribution shown by these different red, green, and blue peaks, that we can get a sense of the age from young to old of what that population might look like. And so if these are the ages of the source areas in different upland catchments, and we were to collect a sample integrating the source areas, we might only see the distribution of signal A and signal C, because only sources A and C are providing sediments to that sedimentary basin, whereas C might be isolated. And so when we look at our data results, I'll show similar age probability curves that give you a sense of the clusters or the groups of different zircon ages that we would collect. So that's the framework for understanding these data sets. Okay, so let's look at the sources. This is a signature of what the modern catchment sources look like. And again, just to orient you, here's the Mission Creek Fault cutting up through. Our study area for the sedimentary succession is this yellow star. And we also collected river drainage samples from each of these catchments from modern river samples. So we collected in the active catchment to try to characterize what the composition of sediment would look like from each of these catchments or drainage basins shown in red. And let me just put the geology behind here so you can see the colored units largely represent the bulk geology or the bulk unit distribution of those rocks. And so rocks of the Peninsular Range and Sierra Nevada batholith are largely shown by these purple and blue colors shown here. So these are different igneous or rocks that crystallize out of magmatic units, granodiorite, monzonite, gabbro diorite, with very distinctive age populations within these rock units. So these are in millions of years. In this burgundy color, you can see that these are largely the Precambrian basement rocks. These have different names, the Pinto Mountain gneiss, the San Gabriel gneiss, and they have a much older age range of their zircons. And so we want to keep an eye out for those rocks that we see as well. And then lastly, if you look up here, especially the ones in yellow, this is a unit that is largely reflecting of kind of middle-aged Neoproterozoic and Paleozoic sedimentary and metamorphic successions. And so the prediction is that these largely have what we'll call recycled Precambrian and Paleozoic zircons. So maybe some of these older basement ages, but also some more intermediate ones between about 400 and 500 million years ago. These were not very well constrained as sources, but we recognize that these rocks here, such as the Big Bear group and others, are Paleozoic in age. And I just want to highlight that these catchments in red capture different distributions of these three very large categories of rocks. And the prediction that the modern samples should represent the distribution of those sediments was an important part of this study that we were able to use moving forward. So we also collected clast counts at each of these locations where we looked at the modern river deposits and characterized the composition of those cobbles. And you don't need to worry about the specific rock names on the bottom. but I will highlight a couple of trends. This is Whitewater River, so this is the westernmost drainage, all the way up to Little Morongo Canyon. This is the easternmost drainage, so we're going from west to east. And you can see that there's some similarity in these class composition and distribution, but also some differences. One particular difference is that these four drainages, the eastern drainages, have a substantial amount of this yellow and brown. These are largely metasedimentary class types. So these are things like amphibolite, phyllite, quartzite, a marble calc schist that we were able to identify. That's very different than some of the other units where we don't see very many of those units themselves. The other thing we see is this presence of a diorite, which is a more intermediate composition of an igneous rock, intermediate to mafic, and that's really important in these four catchments as well. So there were distinct differences among these catchments, common players, but distinct differences in their proportion. So let's look at the fanglomerates. Let's look at the deposits themselves. And so this is an oblique view. We're looking roughly to the west here. The Mission Creek Fault cuts up through like this. And this was the location of that LiDAR data set that I showed just a little bit ago. So we had a really nice exposure of the fanglomerates through this gully here. And this is a panorama of that outcrop section. For scale, here is Kim Blizniak. So you can see that this is a pretty good cut of the sedimentary succession, and we were able to take detailed samples and collect, basically starting a little bit here, and we lost a lot of cover, and we're able to take pretty continuous section all the way up to the top of the unit. So up close, this is a nice example of where the overlying, what we call the Cabezon conglomerate, is in contact with this yellow line here with the underlying rock unit. These are tilted. You can see Kim showing the tilted layers. So these are deformed, uplifted rock units that are creating this strath angular unconformity with the underlying strata. I'm not going to talk about these units too much. They're important to a different part of the story, but I want to recognize that it's this base of the unit and upward that we're really concerned about for the reconstruction of this work. That rock unit, the Cabezon fanglomerate, is characterized by this poorly stratified, you can see some very vague layering within here, weakly channelized pebble to boulder conglomerate with some cases very large megaclasts within it. And this is again a close-up of what some of those cobble compositions look like. So, very, higher energy alluvial fan type deposition. Here's our section. So what I'm showing you here on the right-hand side is just a detailed data collection of the stratigraphy. And you can see that the layering give you a general sense of coarser grained deposits on the right-hand side, and then the more recessive, finer grain units on the left. And a couple things I want to point out. We did try to actually measure from the orientation of these cobbles, the direction of paleoflow, or the direction that these fluvial alluvial deposits were emplaced. And in a few cases, we were able to measure that. They gave a largely kind of southward direction. That's these little black rose petals that are indicating in a compass direction to the south. So not a great data set, but we did our best where we were able to collect that kind of data. But in general, this was the section that we measured and collected detailed samples along the way for our provenance analysis. So if we look at that section, we're focusing, this is the Cabezon fanglomerate up here. The bottom section shows those tilted, deformed gravels of the strath terrace that we won't talk about too much. But I'm using the same coloring of those class types that we used for looking at the modern catchments, again, with the rock type reference here. Quickly note on the bottom, this unit is called the deformed gravels of Whitewater. A great unit, a topic for a different study, so we'll save that. But I just want to make a general comment that the composition throughout this sequence of deposits was pretty uniform. Mostly plutonic, those are the purples and the blues, with a decreasing, or excuse me, with a comparable composition of those metamorphic gneiss rocks as well. As an aside, I would note some confidence that I had in this, because when I work in deeper geologic time records, say, 50 million year old deposits, we might collect one sample from this whole outcrop and call it representative. And I have to say that it was satisfying to measure all of these different class counts and come up with something that was largely uniform. There was an upsection in here where we started to see a little bit more of these more meta-sedimentary units, but the overlying unit, that's the one that we're really focused on today, the Cabezon formation, is interesting. There's an upsection through time increase in the meta-sedimentary class type, so those are the yellows and oranges and browns, and there's a general decrease in gneiss, that's the burgundy color, and a large dominance of these more plutonic igneous class types. We also collected an incised terrace deposit. We call it QT3. It's quite similar in composition to the Cabezon QO unit, but a slightly different proportion of the metamorphic clasts as well. And this terrace deposit was important because it's a much younger sedimentary feature and geomorphic feature, so it gives us kind of an end timing constraint of provenance that is consistent with the Cabezon. Okay, so this is the class compositions that we were able to compare, and I just want to bring this back to the map. And again, highlight that when we look at the available catchments, we're really seeing the distribution of these meta-sedimentary clasts provided largely by these four drainages and not the Claw Flat and Whitewater drainages. We don't have the right players in that mix. So if we compare the sedimentary deposit class compositions with the sediment source area compositions, again, I can highlight that it's these eastern drainages that make the best fit. And Mission Creek notably has the best match in terms of proportion. So this is looking at just the proportion of these different class types, including paying particular attention to the gneiss. So none of them is a perfect fit, but there are trends of convergence in that direction. So we wanted to take this a step further, and these were our samples collected for detrital zircon uranium lead geochronology. We collected 2 from the deformed gravels of Whitewater, 2 from the Cabezon unit, and then 1 from this terrace deposit, the QT3. Okay, so let's look at the Quaternary deposits. I'm showing here as an age distribution, so these are in millions of years, with the relative probability of these different samples. The Cabezon samples, those are the Fanglomerates, those are shown in pinks, and then that QT3 terrace is shown in orange. And so, a couple of comments on this age distribution. One is that we see the younger Sierra Nevada batholith, Peninsula Range batholith ages from the Cretaceous plutons that are largely this very large peak, and the Jurassic plutons, and a few Triassic zircon ages as well. We also capture the Precambrian basement ages. Those are these 2 broad population or humps of zircon dates that are much older, and those are correlative with this Precambrian basement, right? These older gneiss units that make sense. And this little peak here being these diagnostic leucogranites that have a slightly younger age range, and very little of anything else, which was interesting. Some samples had these mixed sedimentary recycled Precambrian rocks that might be represented by these smaller peaks here. Hard to say, there weren't very many grains of that age group. So this is the Quaternary deposits from the sedimentary section. And just to compare in this view, and I won't spend as much time on this, I've separated out the source areas into type 1 source, shown in blue here, and type 2 source. And these are just characterized drainages that have different zircon distributions and class types. And so Whitewater and Catclaw Flat sit here on the bottom. And the biggest difference is really in the magnitude of the peaks, where the type 2 source has a much larger component of the Cretaceous pluton ages, and the type 1 source has a larger or equivalent source from the Jurassic, and slightly different distributions in the Precambrian ages. So just comparing these curves, you can see that there's a lot of similarity, but there are some distinct differences, particularly in the magnitude of these rocks. So I'll show this a slightly different way, and we performed a statistical test on these age distributions, and now I'm showing, again, this is still age in millions of years, but instead of a relative probability, I'm showing just the cumulative probability from 0% to 100%. And you can still see where those peaks would show up. These are the vertical lines of large proportion, very little ages of this range, and then these older peaks here. And I like this plot because it actually shows some really important differences between these age distributions and this was how I differentiated between type 2 sources that matched a Kolmogorov-Smirnov statistical test of similarity and potentially coming from the same source with source 1. So again, these are the active drainages. If we map on here the Quaternary deposits, you can see that the Cabezon conglomerates are in pink and the QT younger terrace is here in orange, that they are a better fit to the type 1 source and actually using the statistic are ruled out when we look at the type 2 source. Again, highlighting the importance of the magnitude of these different age populations. So all the age populations are there, but their proportion ends up being really important. And largely because that reflects the proportion of these rock units in the landscape in terms of their erodibility and contribution to the samples. So we interpreted that type 1 sources were really the best fit. We couldn't necessarily distinguish between among the type 1 sources, but in general, we found that these two blue lines enclosed the pink lines the best. And so that corresponds to Mission Creek in the solid blue and Morongo Valley Canyon in the dashed blue. So what I want to do is walk through a proposal that we've put together that highlights an interpretation of how we interpret the provenance based on clasts and detrital zircon geochronology and sandstone petrography, which I did not show here, but it's just another metric of provenance. And so this right-hand panel captures the very simplified view of these different drainages. So Mission Creek Fault is here in red. The reconstructed drainages from east to west. And again, the Whitewater Canyon. And in our interpretation, the deposits of the Cabezon, that's this tan colored here, QO, we believe to have been sourced based on this work, most likely from the Mission Creek. We think that the convergence of the zircon data, as well as the class data and the paleo flow make the most sense for Mission Creek. And so you can see that this would be a kind of an oblique deposit of Fanglomerate that's buttressed by pre-existing topography shown here by this dashed line. This is the Coachella Fanglomerate Hill that's basically funneling the geometry of these deposits on top of that. And so this is time 1, pre-faulting. Time 2 recognizes that this lower block has moved to the west relative to the upper block. And at this time, the Mission Creek has continued to deposit, but it's also incised or eroded down into the Quaternary deposits to place these younger units, the QF2 and our QT3 terrace. So that's the next geomorphic feature that developed through here. So we have provenance from the Fanglomerates and provenance also from that terrace deposit there too. And then finally, continued fault motion along this fault system basically continued to displace the Fanglomerate deposits and moved it westward, and the Whitewater Canyon incised in next to it, and the Mission Creek incised down into its current location and deposited these younger alluvial fans. So this map on the left is the modern day digital elevation model showing the distribution of these drainages, again, giving you a sense of this reconstruction that we've put together. And I want to highlight that this unit here, it's called the Beheaded Mission Creek, or dry tributary is what I like to call it. And that's a tributary that is essentially abandoned and beheaded by the northern part of this fault. And so we like this interpretation because it actually has a nice explanation for how this dry tributary, which is this one here, should have been carved and fed by the ancestral Mission Creek when this block used to be located farther west. So there's a variety of different stages of this construction, but the biggest take home is that we don't think these deposits were in place after fault motion. We think they were deposited before and during fault motion. It's quite different for the timing of this part of the Mission Creek fault strand. Okay, so some implications for this. This work has suggestions that the provenance or the source of the Cabezon is best matched with Mission Creek and or Morongo Valley Canyon. If you put some numbers on this, so I started the talk talking about slip rates. We're looking at on the order of 3 to 8 kilometers of fault displacement since about 260,000 years ago, which is the uppermost age of these Cabezon deposits. This is a difficult number to constrain because, you know, we're looking at just the sedimentary deposits. We don't have a really clear character of the distribution or the shape of that alluvial fan to really pinpoint the actual slip. So this is a broad range. So I'm really hesitant to give an actual number on this. So a slip rate is just the distance over time. But if you were to put a number on that, it's about 11 to 30 millimeters per year maximum slip rate. So it's no more than that. The real slip rate contribution that we provided was really looking at this QT3 terrace, and that's the one that comes out of dry tributary, because this is a much clearer geomorphic feature with a more restricted range of offset that can be linked back to Mission Creek itself. So if we look at that slip reconstruction, that's about 2.5 kilometers of displacement since its deposition about 100,000 years ago. And these ages are based on a couple of different recent studies. One is a burial age on the Cabezon unit, and one is infrared stimulated luminescence on the QT3. And so that gives a maximum slip rate, so it's up to this value of about 20 to 30 millimeters per year since 1,000 years ago. And that's a kind of high number, especially given that this part of the fault strand had been recognized and interpreted as being inactive based on the available mapping and geology that had been, you know, out there. And so a couple of important takeaways is that our rate is comparable when we start looking at the present day slip rate based on geodetic measurements across this part of southern San Andreas fault. And so when we look at that rate, and this is a long-term rate, this is over the last 100,000 years, some implication here is that this part of the fault strand, not only was it once a principal structure, but it might have remained more active into late Quaternary time than had been previously recognized. While we were writing this paper and we had a lot of dialogue back and forth, I was really excited because I was contacted by Craig Nicholson, who he and his colleagues have been collecting microseismicity data and analyzing it along this area. And so this is an oblique view with depth. So we're looking down 20 kilometers from the northeast to the southwest through the San Gorgonio Pass region. And all of these different colored panels just represent tilted or steeply dipping fault surfaces. And you can see here that the Garnet Hill and the Banning Fault are quite active, these little clusters of microseismicity. But what he pointed out to us is that the Mission Creek also has its cluster of seismicity that they interpret as being active on that fault itself. So it was really interesting and validating to see some other researchers re-looking at the Mission Creek strand in a slightly different way. So that was pretty cool. So if we go back to our chart here, this was our understanding of the faulting. And I think our contribution is adding that it is, you know, active more recently into the future, into present day. And so that really changes how we think about implications for the long-term fault history through this area. And potentially, if Kim's geomorphic mapping of the LiDAR data are correct, that it could actually change interpreting that map as potentially having active risk assessment. So again, here we are working on a segment of the fault that in black is inactive. And I think our contribution would suggest that we need to spend more time looking at this part of the fault to really bring to light that it might be a more significant feature. The last thing I'll point out here is, again, we know that these segments of the Banning Fault and the Garnet Hill Fault are important players in the San Andreas Fault evolution, but much of their displacement is actually more vertical than lateral, meaning their displacement is largely causing these parts of the mountains to be uplifted. And so one possibility is that the Mission Creek strand, as it passes through here, is actually taking up more of that lateral side-to-side motion along the plate boundary, and the Garnet Hill Banning faults are taking up more of that vertical offset within that plate boundary. So those are just some ideas, but it's a way of looking at the San Gorgonio Pass region that takes into account some of these different and new data sets. All right, I'd love time for questions, so I'm just going to leave you with some very general takeaways. One is that faulting, we think, has occurred more recently than previously thought, certainly as young as 100 to 260,000 years based on these deposits. We think that this is motivation for further study for the reasons I've just described. And lastly, this was a really interesting and fun project to work on. I think it pushed the bounds of using detrital provenance methods at these relatively very short spatial and time scales. So we needed to be able to evaluate differences in catchments across very short spatial scales. So that was a very challenging and also a very fun project for me to work on. So I will leave it at that and take any questions that you might have, either verbally or through the chat box. I have to open that up here. So thank you very much. I appreciate your attention, especially in this odd virtual setting.
Thank you, Julie. Round of applause showing up in the chat.
To be
so
like
as
NPR.
always, so as always, folks, please post questions in the Q&A. And if you'd like to ask a question verbally, just raise your hand and I'll be happy to call on you. And open up your mic. We're getting a flood of questions on the Q&A though, so we can just get started on those. So Megan Bromley asks, if you don't talk more about it by the end of the talk, maybe you did, but let you be the judge, could you explain more about how you go about finding or mapping really precise plate boundaries like the one in the sidewalk photo when the creep is really slow?
That's a great question. I'm going to try to tackle it, not being a tectonic geomorphologist myself, but just recognizing that the quality of your geomorphic signal is going to be highly variable. If it's a vegetated area, it's going to be harder to see. So having the value of data sets like the LiDAR I showed gives you the ability to see that. Honestly, on the ground mapping, if it is very slow and if it's not a long-term feature like that dragon's back, topography I showed at the beginning, it could be challenging to study. And I think that's a great question because I think it speaks to why this area has been mapped so extensively. There's been so much work there, but it's these kinds of data sets that just hadn't been used yet or available that gives us new insight. So Megan, I hope that gives you some answer to your question.
All right, Catherine Elder asks, what type of process would cause a fault line to become inactive?
Again, a structural geologist is going to tap into this a little bit better. My answer would be that it depends on a variety of factors. One could be that the way the stress is resolved across the fault might change so that another structure or propagating a new structure would be a more preferred configuration. So as long as the stress is being reflected by that active structure, it's potentially active, but if the dynamics change or the stress state changes, you might shift to a different structure. So many plate boundaries, is my understanding, is that they're going to evolve, and any individual fault might be active for a couple millions of years and then cease, or be a more through-going structure. Again, I'm a sedimentary tectonic basin analyst, geochronologist, masquerading as a tectonic geomorphologist. So where's Kim? Thanks, Catherine. That's a great question.
And we're going to stay with sort of these focus questions for a bit. Jose Iturralde asks, with the grinding down of zircon crystals, if I understood correctly, you're looking for uranium decomposition to age them. How much uranium is found naturally in creeks and riverbeds in order to allow for this method of testing?
So the zircon grains themselves, depending on their magmatic or metamorphic chemistry, have variable uranium and also thorium, which is an important alpha decay particle there. They can be, tens of parts per million to a couple hundred to 1,000 parts per million. So the value of zircon is that as an accessory mineral, it concentrates uranium and thorium in its crystal structure. So when we analyze it, there's enough in the crystal to be measurable. If we were actually just to look in creeks and riverbeds, I don't know if you mean just collecting from, an aggregate sand sample or from the water. Probably not very much, although I can tell you I live on the Glastonbury Gneiss here in Connecticut, which has very high uranium, and we have to test our groundwater pretty frequently. So, but we're mainly focusing on the zircons. We're mainly focusing on these crystals that concentrate it from their history.
All right, sticking with technical questions, we have some bigger picture questions that we'll get to towards the end, but Jerry Moore asks, is it typical for only a portion of the fault to become inactive while another part remains active?
I think that the fault itself as a, think of it as a surface. So if there's an earthquake rupture on that fault or slow creep, that structure is potentially slipping. Maybe in creep settings, you can have various phases of inactive or active, but one thing is that we use the word strand to identify a part of that fault segment. Maybe Ramon or someone else could tackle that a little better. That's my attempt.
All right, we've got all these tectonics questions.
Yep. I know, ask me sediment questions.
If anybody wants to, if any of our tectonics faculty want to
these are great.
welcome.
These are awesome questions. The beauty is getting to study these interesting questions in an area and thinking about it with some different, different tools.
So let me get to a broader question that Waleed asks. I'll tweak it just a little bit. He asks, what is your advice on leading such geological studies? How do you make a successful study with a team that has a lot of variables to account for? And I'll just broaden it to say that covers a lot of disciplines, right? Because tectonics, sedimentology. So how do you just in practice go about doing that?
A lot of communication. So, Kim and I knew each other in grad school. So we were aware of each other's research expertise. And so when we came at this project, kind of linked through Kai Johnson at Indiana, we had to be very clear about what data sets. And again, we talk at different timescales. So I would say just a lot of communication and iterative work. We're in the field together, our students work together. So I guess as much interaction as you can so that she could get immersed in the provenance work and I could get immersed more in the geomorphic aspect of it, helped us communicate with each other on that front. Because, you might try to do something and then you realize that you're going to hit an obstacle because it's just not possible. And so this was a great study because we could find what worked to answer the questions that we were trying to get at, and then a little bit of luck.
Yep. I mean, I've found. I wonder if you found this too. That when I've been involved in work across disciplines, sometimes the closer the disciplines are, sometimes paradoxically the harder it is to get people to talk across disciplines because they kind of think they should know each other's stuff. Like when I brought astronomers and biologists together, that's easy because they don't expect to understand each other, so they'll ask the dumb questions. But you bring a geochemist, you bring a surface geochemist and a solid earth geochemist together, and they kind of think they ought to kind of know each other's stuff, and they're kind of a little embarrassed to reveal that they don't know basic things. Have you experienced that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think that's really important and valid. And I've tried to be. I think as I've gotten more along in my career, I've stopped worrying about asking questions that might be silly because you end up really finding out some neat things in that regard. So I think in this case we were just different enough to be able to do that and really talk to each other, but close enough that we could still make some really fast progress on the problems. So yeah, totally. It was a fun one.
Well, so Ramon says he likes the answers. So you pass your tectonics part of your.
I was curious. Okay, thanks, Ramon. I was hoping that I wasn't.
And he writes a complex fault array. Strands will turn on and off as the stress and the geometry evolves over different timescales.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna write that down. So, I will say that I did kind of go running back to the Miocene and Jackie Giblin's master's thesis. We extracted ourselves from the Quaternary because we decided that the Miocene rocks in the area were super cool. So that's an ongoing project right now.
Okay, and then Dwayne DeVecchio asks in the chat, but this is like, you'll like this question, I think. Although I'm not sure I fully understand the location of the terrace deposits with respect to the fanglomerates, is it possible that the terrace deposits are just reworked fanglomerates and therefore the terrace was never linked to Mission Creek?
That is a possibility. And what's tricky there is that they do share a lot of similar features. One thing that I would note is that the geometry of those terrace deposits, the way they're incised into the fanglomerate, makes it seem like they are a distinct unit. Unfortunately, that terrace is not an extensively preserved feature within the whole area where you'd have multiple terrace outcrops to study. But one thing I'd like to do, and this is what John, Maddie, and I have talked about, is using some of these same provenance methods, not so much on the terrace, but on those younger QF2 and QF3 fans that are the bigger deposits within that area. And I think that would help answer Dwayne's question for sure.
Dwayne says thanks. And looking at the time, I think it's time for us all to thank you because we're pretty much at time. So Julie, thank you very much. That was great. And judging by the questions, you've stimulated a lot of interest. So thank you very much for that. And
Cool.
Thanks for taking the time to remotely visit us.
Well, thank you again for the awesome opportunity. I really appreciate it. And I hope to see you soon. So stay safe, everyone.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Thank you.